Hello, Snow Nerd. I'm doing another one of these talking head vids where I've done a time lapse for working on a recent project and just talking a bit about it, because these are quite enjoyable for me. Just to reflect back on a piece of work I've just finished doing over a period of 2 nights. So pretty prototypal, but quite an interesting concept for script. 2 primary scripts in this example and a basic game prototype design of sorts, though this is probably mainly going to be used as a feature for a game that I'm working with heat assembly on as a contributed scripts mostly, some level design. But basically Jake from heat assembly brought up the subject of biocomputing and trying to incorporate that into the existing project that we have working on at the minute. And I found one of the ideas he talked about quite fascinating, the idea of an organic sort of virus taking over a machine. So I want to explore this idea of a spread of an infection, and then you as the player having to avoid that infection and escape it or otherwise counteract it, right? So this is the working prototype we've got going. Currently at the minute the main risks to the player are touching the infected areas. The infection spreads at a variable rate which you can set in the component property. And the player must find the green exit in time. The geometries are procedurally generated, so all the primitives that are the boxes are procedurally generated at runtime when the scene loads up. And then there's an infected single point of origin, which is also randomly placed, which provides the challenge to the player in the form of the virus. You're sort of like a jetpacking hero, I suppose. The player is, you got like a sort of jetpack, and then you sort of parachute in at the first. So I had a lot of fun playing with physics of this project, as well as like a few different aesthetic ideas. My main aim, of course, though, being just getting this script to replicate this kind of behavior of a virus spreading through a bunch of meshes to work. So I'm going to just document that process. This is obviously, like I said, the final project, but there were several parts to this development of this prototype, which I'm really happy with actually, and even if it doesn't get integrated into ZMal, I will be potentially developing it to its own little mini project. Had a lot of very nice just really joy, like really exciting to program this. I got a big thing for like doing procedurally generated stuff, just like finding the edges are and like how much you can customize it and all that sort of thing. Yeah. So the music playing in the background is by Jake himself actually as well. So he's, again, as part of that, helps inform my sort of ideas around the texture work, and which at the minute, like you'll see as we go on actually further, because this video's in a strange order. Obviously I'm just showing the final result now. Is still like a test version of what the finished thing might be, but yeah, I went through several different iterations of design for the idea of the water, which was a bit of a late addition, was probably around cooling, because these primitives that generated do look like giant servers. But again, there's not much story or narrative weaved into any of this. It's like I said, it's more of a sandbox demo I've created to trial a mechanic in a game. But I've decided to take it off on a little its own environmental sandbox dimension. So there is, like I said, there is like a little mini game within the feature, which is probably going to be incorporated into another game, right? I'm not sure exactly how it'll be incorporated in, but again, like at the minute we're trying to, with ZMalfunction's development, we're experimenting with different features. Like recently I've also been working on a flyable drone, controllable drone, that the player controller in a first person typical view can grab it and then basically control the drone as you would in real life. That's a separate piece of project to this, but yeah. In terms of like things that could improve, obviously I think the graphics do still need a bit of work. I just generated it with AI, the current machine ones, which is just a bit generic, and I think it could be given more character. And that's something I'm probably going to have. I might experiment with creating a few tile sets, trying to incorporate a few different designs, because it's a fairly simple switch. the textures are actually applied in the procedural generation script. Anyway, this is actually taking us back to the start of experimenting with getting this mesh spreading script to work. So this is the very, very early days. This is how the game started out, just like there you got the first sort of spread working there. The only problem I had here was that, so box primitives were spreading fine, but any other complex mesh didn't seem to work, though I did get this working eventually. And I figured out the reason, which was because I wasn't actually selecting the mesh for the mesh collider, so that was my bad. I had to adjust some of the spread settings and the properties for the component. So the component has a few customizable properties. I have made some use of ChatGPT for generating these scripts because it just saves a lot of boilerplate, to be honest. And whilst I'm sure the scripts aren't completely optimized, I think they're optimized the most. I mean, in general, for the scripts that you need for the generation and the spread, you're talking about 300 lines of code overall. So yeah, it's not really nothing too absurd, I don't think, in terms of size. It's like 20,000 lines or something. In fact, one thing I will say though is that again, as of when I've previously used ChatGPT to generate a few methods and boilerplate to save time, you do have to watch out for bugs that crawl in. So, and I think the best, this is a fairly obvious point, but you get the most out of prompting ChatGPT or a tool like that for boilerplate code when you actually understand what you want. Plus, so you need to understand a little bit about object entities, a little bit about how component systems work in Unity to get the most out of it, or anything really. And you can make quite a lot of nice optimizations, I think, when you get more familiar with that, really. So one of the major ones I made eventually in terms of optimizations was, I think at first it was doing, the actual spread was occurring based on collisions between objects with a certain range. Well, that's still involved in the script somewhat, and I'm not really stress tested it, but at the minute, the basic way that the infection spreads is, I think it does it with array list items, which is another way of saying array items, and then finding the nearest object that way, because of the way the actual primitives are added. It's the for loop, it's a nested for loop, so each one will have, like a position in a list and shit. Oh yeah. Then here I was starting to experiment with, obviously like different heights. Not really much in terms of texture, just very much dev art to just check that infected and cured one. So at first also I had this idea of a cure and of infected spread, so that they'd almost fight with each other. Which I thought would be quite interesting. So almost, like a sort of battle of nature. You'd have the virus and the immunity, which white blood cells type thing, which I might revisit that. But for now, obviously, as I went on, I wanted to get the basic spread working first, and then maybe revisit that. One idea I did have for a gameplay mechanic would be that the player has to click to seed a cured cube, and then that would then create its own spread, but you'd have to be limited on. There would be various things to consider there. And yeah, I was starting to experiment, obviously, with just trying to not like nail down a look, but I just wanted to experiment with a few different aesthetics anyway. It's something I'm trying to do a lot more of. Even if I'm just doing a prototype like this, I want to just sort of experiment with different looks. Though I think at first I did settle into something I've become very familiar with, almost to the point where it's like a comfort zone of doing like brutalism. Or looking at those kinds of textures, the grungy, depressing 70s architecture. Now, while some examples of that are, like in terms of design, are amazing and weird and strange, I do want to venture out of that comfort zone a little bit at some point. That's where I'd first sort of created the meat texture as well. unfortunately, you've just seen it. Well, I was literally listening to the news about Ian Watkins' death, the Lost Prophets. He was a terrible human being. So yeah, I think this is actually maybe the day after Ian Watkins was killed. Anyway, this isn't about Ian Watkins. He's dead, and that's probably good. Anyway, onwards from that guy. So yeah, I want this like muted blue sort of terrain, and you know, I wanted that could replicate that look, which is already existing actually in the game. So again, taking this opportunity of doing a sandboxing project, which is essentially producing a script, taking it as an opportunity to just play around with a few different ideas in terms of color palettes as well. So that's one thing I do really love with like little fun projects like this, is you can have like, you can twist and turn in multiple directions. Like this is obviously when I was moving towards the end, about 3/4 through. A bit later on, we'll actually loop back to a different point. But again, you can see how long every part of the development process, you're getting involved in a different workflow state for a different thing. So definitely towards the end, I like doing refinements. In terms of my actual visual design, I tend to take it in stages. So yeah, block out colors and then add textures, then think about enhancements after that. So obviously I'm not at the end of it here. There's definitely another loop around the old spiral I could do, definitely the iterative spiral for the graphics and the texture application. Like I said, I've already had a few thoughts about definite ways to improve that. But again, it's about you iterate one part of that design, you know, like whether it be the floor texture, whether it be the generated shapes or the meat itself, which could definitely do with some work still. I mean, it's okay. There's like a generic meat texture that I've put on there, but as you can see there, the actual materials themselves look just not very inorganic. They look very shiny, and I need to obviously modify that. I think I do actually later on. But yeah, I do adjust the lighting settings a bit later, but again, I need to look at that and refine that further too. Lighting's actually a really like sophisticated aspect of level design, environmental design, in fact. Often undervalued, but it creates a huge amount of atmosphere. Now, I've not done nearly enough here with lighting. I've just got the very basics in. There's a bit of a light, but, you know, even for objects like this, which is the exit, you could give that a glow. It's another indicator for the player as well. They can. And possibly even with the infection, I was thinking it would be quite I've not actually implemented this, but you know, to have like a sort of expanding sort of sphere or like fog at least around when the spread is spreading. That might be quite an interesting. The only problem with that, of course, is like optimizing it so that the particle systems aren't insane. Because obviously if you're generating millions of particles and then spreading them and then never destroying them, that quickly becomes an issue for any rendering, you know, because just more to process in terms of the particles, so that can become quite complicated, I guess. Anyway, yeah, I did a lot of experimenting with the jump heights as well, because like again, I sort of settled on this idea of a jetpack, which again, I need to add some sort of model and particle effects to really properly get that working. But I settled on this idea of you parachute in, so you've got to do a little bit of maneuvering to try and find the optimum position, and then you've got quite a high jump, so it feels like you're almost boosting yourself in the air. Now this does still need a bit of tweaking, but yeah, you can see there it's more like you launch yourself in the air, right? So you've got these quite large jumps you can do, and then a descent which you have to control. I did speed it up as well because it takes a lot of tweaking, especially with physics things like this, to really figure out like what's the like optimum that you want, because you want the ability to do fairly crazy things but not too crazy that, you know, you're sort of launched into outer space like the speed of light. But you also want it so you can also realistically dodge things as well. So for example, when there's you need to give the player at least a chance. So this in this scenario, for example, I'm very near some red spread. But if I have like not even a 5-second window to get away from that, again, that will diminish. You want it to be challenging enough, but also not so challenging that you just die every 2 seconds. Funnily enough, actually, one of the first problems, which we'll probably go on to later, when you see the earlier prototypal stuff I was working on just before this stage, was in fact that every time the player was spawning in, they were generally landing in water, which is an instant death. So the scene would load, and then the player would immediately just drown, and then drown again, like 4 times in a row until you were lucky enough to hit a generation that generated like a piece of land or a cube, basically. So I was just there like dying 10 times in a row, and then actually just being able to, the game would stabilize, and you get the random enough generation. This is one of the weird things with procedural generation, though. It's like one of the things there is a factor of control in procedural generation, even though it's random, because you have to consider things like that, right? Because you don't want, for example, the player just to spawn. Like if you're doing this on a big scale and you're generating an entire level, you don't want a player to spawn within a wall, for example, because then they're stuck there. And if you were making a game, for example, which relied on that as its main feature, it's an extremely hard thing to implement, actually. I've only managed to ever do this sort of like procedural generation with like, cuboid type environments, or some meshes and other things. I've done some other stuff in the past, but it's a very, 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 very tough thing to actually balance correctly. And there is like I said, there is a degree of control. So this is an earlier experiment I was doing, again, with those like parameters. So this was more of I was implementing, this is before the previous videos I just showed, so it's the stage before, where I basically started nailing the mechanic, essentially, but it was more like I was like treading on boards rather than like, like almost like these almost city-like structures. And I quite like this look, but it was too flat as well. It felt too, it just felt too flat. And yeah, I was landing in the water half the time. As you can see there was sort of the problems going on before, of how I'd end up just plonking in the water straight away. And again, adjusting sort of lighting settings here and just seeing what sort of looks can be achieved quite rapidly with directional lighting. There's a few other types of lighting in there as well. I think we've got some points and spots, maybe. I think I tried to implement spots, but I've not really done a great job of it. I just did a basic one, but it's something I need to probably revisit, to be honest. Yeah. So yeah, obviously just trying to think what else I could talk about. So though, obviously did put in a canvas with some UI for health, and again, all that is in a minute is literally just an indicator of health. Technically, when you touch the meat or the infected primitives, it takes off 25 health, but it does that per collision, so that's basically per second. So it basically does it every single second you're colliding with it at the present. Now, I was probably going to implement that properly. You'd probably want like a 5-second delay between the damage being applied. Otherwise, yeah, the player obviously dies instantly. And collision with the floor, they die instantly, because that's supposed to simulate, sort of falling into water, drowning, or cooling, whatever it is. Like, if we can assume that this is like some sort of machinery or server architecture that's being spread, when organic virus is taking control of it, which after all is the original idea of like a biocomputer, then it would be cooling liquid, I guess. At this point, it was just a texture, but then I managed to implement some water shader I found. Again, I just found that online, but it sort of looks pretty good, though I've not really had much of a chance to experiment with it hugely, but that could probably be refined a lot further. But I mean, in terms of like having a surface of water in the game, which gives it its look, then yeah, it works. That's good. Oh yeah, and a lot of jumping around here. Again, testing out the different settings for the spread. So you can set the amount of fill for like different primitives to how full is the scene of the primitives. Is it quite sparse? So you can tweak things like that. If you wanted to take it even further, you can literally randomize the fill every time as well. So there's enough that would actually be fairly typically easy to do. The only problem, again, with that is that you lose control to the point where you could have, unless you set a min and a max for the generated randoms, you're going to have some generated scenes which would be unplayable or unwinnable, I guess, potentially anyway. But again, that's part of the joy of it. The HR Geiger designs, I might revisit this if I do some actual tile sets for it, because obviously I can't just slap some of HR Geiger's art on a texture and use it in the game. and you know, definitely certainly can't sell it. But I just wanted it as a good starting point because I love his examples of design, the Necronomicon work and such. I just love it as a mixture of industrial design and surrealist art. So I'm thinking a different direction I might take it down is to, and I think I'll do this anyways, to create a entirely new texture set, but on that theme a bit more, potentially with the like ZMal style color palette that we've been looking at, and then share that with the other developer at Heat Assembly, see what he thinks, and then see if we can integrate that into the game. Because like obviously trying to represent a biocomputer is quite a difficult idea to get your grapple with, I suppose, in your head. But yeah, I would imagine it would be some sort of like metal as fuck H.R. Geiger style mega computer, right? Like Warhammer 40k on steroids, Apple Mac by the God Emperor or something. Yeah, obviously because I was like had this idea of the player being in a jetpack. I want to find some little simple jetpack sounds. Funnily enough, I couldn't find anything that good for jetpacks very fast. I thought there'd be loads of jetpack sounds, but there wasn't that many. It's like jet aeroplane and stuff, nearly all of them, and only one like jetpack sound, which surprised me. So I can't remember what I did. I just think I found some other random sound, and it's this really just needs a rethink. I just wanted to plonk something in instead of like we had the generic Quake jump sound in, but that is the very definition of generic, so I had to change that. Of course, it's way too generic. And yeah, here we are, basically testing out Ad Infinitum, the final loop of the game. But yeah, this is a really interesting game to work on. Very like weird and paradoxical spaces. Again, I said this wasn't exactly in order, but we've rewound back to the sort of start of prototyping again there, and just again, like this is the early prompting for doing some of the C# scripting for infections and cures. I find it's kind of helpful as well, like using ChatGPT, because I can sort of hash out ideas, and then and obviously I could like handwrite all that code that's just generated there for like defining properties on the component and exposing methods and blah 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 blah. But again, it's like, as long as I can describe adequately in natural language, I know enough to be able to refine. Well, one of the refinements we made actually as I went on, especially with the procedural generation, was to add box colliders instead of mesh, because mesh colliders are more expensive computationally. So I changed that, which was a good idea. I mean, it is definitely more computationally decent. But I find it pretty easy, to be honest, like being able to debug it even sometimes, because yeah, it often does get namespaces wrong, or just variable names wrong, or like changes it. So yeah, you have to watch out for that, definitely. But in terms of like, yeah, using it for feature development, I think it's alright. I mean, I still had to modify the scripts. I still had to make sure everything plugged in correctly. I still had to double check naming and do all that. But it does definitely, it lessens the implementation, not really the cognitive. You still have to think, you still have to problem solve, because you want to keep it, you want to keep the code relatively decoupled, I suppose. I mean, obviously I've got like a main gameplay script, which essentially is a procedural dungeon generator, because that sets the scene, right? And then all the other scripts just define behavior for those objects which are generated, and then they are attached as components, right? You can see that there. So you've got procedural dungeon generation, which is essentially just the beginning loop which generates all those primitives. Here I am doing a lot of debugging as well, so pausing in the play mode, inspecting the individual primitives. At first there was a load of weird things with, like, I wasn't sure why sometimes it's spreading, sometimes it's not, so there's a lot of back and forth there. Looking back, debugging. This is more going into the programming now, isn't it, I guess. So yeah, just a lot of debugging, going back, debugging. Now this is a interesting phase of development. Again, this is almost going back to the start, where it's like the fundamentals onward from the grey part with the masks and stuff, where again, I've got the basics running, and I'll make it further. And again, this is prior to texturing stage and the HR Geiger stage even. It's almost gone reverse backwards anyway. I sort of messed up sequencing these time-lapse clips, but again, that's what, in a way, that's sort of funny, because it's like the creative process itself is a strange one. So it's almost funnier to see it back in reverse. Anyway, but yeah, again, like this is like where it's more the board stage, where it's like, you know, almost like more like platforming in between bits of wood that's floating in the water or something, right? Okay, it's amazing how verticality or just like making generated primitives or meshes more. This was quite an interesting look. So I had like the HR Geiger, but with like a bluer look and a more metallic look as well. But yeah, I decided to increment on for this point, which is the video footage we just shot a bit before. But yeah, I hope you found that interesting. I think I'm going to leave it there, because I think saying anything more, I'm just going to be yabbering. So I'll leave it there. I hope that you found this insightful or interesting. I do have other videos where I just do this, where I just have a time lapse and talk a bit about the development process as I went on, as I just showcase that. If you have any thoughts, or if you've got a project you might want me to try out, or especially a tutorial for Unity, do let me know. I'm using Unity a lot more, obviously just as a consequence of my work as a teacher, but also my hobbyist developer work with heat assembly at the minute. So again, something I'm looking to develop anyway. And a copy of this game will be on my itch.io .noir. And yeah, you can play it for free. I'm gonna just have a downloadable version, and yeah, hopefully some variant of this will be featured in ZMalfunction, which is a work in progress game I'm doing with heat assembly. And you can find a few clips of that online. There's a few things I've posted on here before, and heatassembly.com, you can go on there and have a look there. I've yabbered for way too long now. Have a great evening. I've been Chris, and yeah, have a good one.